This section of the videos will consider the PARMS Priority Clusters part of the software. Priority Clusters is accessed through the modeling panel, and we select it simply by pressing on the button, and that will reveal all of the clusters that have been generated in the software. These clusters with the red tag on them have been generated by another user. I can switch to my clusters and find that I haven't generated any clusters up to yet. In terms of the cluster tree, we can open a cluster from the tree, and this will then open a new tab with the cluster information provided. When the cluster tab opens, it will open to the query view, and because it's already an existing cluster, if I step over into the define, I can see all of the assets in a given shutoff block and those that are selected for renewal. If I step over again, I can look at where that cluster is in the network. The solid lines are those assets that are selected for renewal. The dotted lines are in the same shutoff block, but not selected for renewal. These orange lines are other clusters. Let us consider that I wish to add these. I can do that from the GIS simply by clicking on the asset and marking it for renewal, or I can go back into the define and select the renewal directly. If I then save that cluster is saved, and that is now defined as renewing the whole shutoff block. You can see there are 263 meters of renewal in this shutoff block. The heuristics are dealt with in the manual, but are effectively a shortcut for selecting poorly performing pipes for renewal. So if I clear all of my ticks, what the software does is select all of the assets that are rated at a failure rating of 5 or more. And if it can't meet 225 meters, which is the target length, it will drop down to rating 4. I'm currently using statistical predictions. So in other words, if my statistical predictions are such that the asset is rated a 5, it will be selected for renewal. As a reminder, our ratings are set up in the settings in this table here, and currently I'm using statistical predictions, and so any asset with a predicted failure rate above 180 will be selected, and the test will then be made around the target length. If the target length can't be made, it will drop down and try and make up the length via all those assets that have a rating 4, which is defined as 70 failures per 100 kilometers per year here. So in terms of my heuristics, these assets have been selected and been selected for renewal. This asset hasn't been selected, and we can see why. Because this asset is above 70, but this asset is below. But going back to our settings, our statistical prediction is set to 70. This asset has a predicted failure rate of 69 and therefore isn't selected. If in my settings I set this to 65, and then clear the heuristics, run them again, now this asset is being picked up because it's within the range that I've specified. So where do these clusters come from? For the most part, we are generating them using the ACG tool. The ACG tool can be run at a query level or a folder level. To run the ACG, I simply right-click on the folder and press Generate Clusters. This will then fire up the ACG module, and the ACG will attempt to find assets that meet the criteria that are specified in the associated queries. So in this case, I've run the ACG on the P3 folder, And so PARMS is applying the P3A query and the P3B query, and it's found these clusters that meet the criteria as specified in these queries. If I move to the excluded, you can see that there's a range of assets that have been excluded from the ACG, and that is because they're already in an existing cluster. I can force those to be generated, and then I will have a longer list to generate. I'll rerun that so that I'm not duplicating clusters. So I again have my series of assets that meet the criteria that I'm running the ACG on. I have several options down here. The first one tells the software that I'm interested in the seed assets, the problem assets that are driving renewal. The second is that it will apply heuristics, which is the same heuristics that we applied just in the previous cluster. Those heuristics are set in the setting under cluster rules. So here you can see these are the base rules that we're applying for the heuristics, which means that, again, any asset that is rated at likelihood 5 will be selected for renewal. If we have not reached 150 meters, it will drop down to the secondary rating, which we changed recently to 65. We can also change whether it's based on historical failures or statistical failures, or the external likelihood rating, which isn't set up in this software because I'm not connected into an external likelihood database. Returning to my ACG, I'll generate the clusters again. From the user's perspective, I am reliant on the fact that the settings has already been set up as the company wants, or I can select a setting that I have set up for my own purposes. The other tick box allows me to force all of the clusters to be put together in a single cluster, which can be useful when you're doing T&D analysis or for other purposes. So to generate clusters in these shutoff blocks, I simply press generate. I will get a warning that says there's 13 clusters to be generated, and then the software will go off and generate the clusters according to the rules that I've set in the heuristics. So now you can see I have a folder full of clusters. The red mark is no longer there because these are now my clusters. Again, I can open one of the clusters, move over to the define, and see that in this case, the shutoff block is made up of one asset which has been selected for renewal because its failure rate is above that associated with a likelihood rating of 5. You can see also in the information I have my predictions, but I also have the historical failures associated with this asset. So this asset has had 12 failures on it and is predicted to fail 5 times in the next 10 years. When I exit the cluster, I get an information panel which asks me if I want to change the status of the cluster. This is useful when you're reviewing a range of clusters and you want to mark them as either reviewed or planned, or you can retain the current status. If I go over to my cluster management table and I search for the cluster that we have just looked at, you can see here, this is the cluster that we just opened, and it's got a cluster status of potential. Potential effectively means that it's been generated by the ACG. If I have reviewed the cluster and I've decided to retain it, I would move it to either reviewed or planned. When it moves from being a planned cluster to an active cluster, I can change the cluster to active. Statuses that are planned, active, and complete are shown within the maintenance table. Under some use cases, I may be investigating shutoff block or an asset for the business, and I may want to generate a cluster directly from that shutoff block or asset. So If we run this query and order by lifetime failures, we can see that this asset here has 10 lifetime failures. If I select the row and move over into the failures area, I can look at the failure information against that asset. I can also look in the GIS to see where the asset is. Moving back to the asset table, I am interested in whether or not this asset is in a current cluster, which it is. The third one down, however, isn't in an active cluster, and that has 7 failures. Perhaps this asset has failed, and my manager is interested in where this would sit in the cluster prioritization. So I can select the shutoff block from the cell and then move down into priority clusters and start a new cluster. It's reasonable to name the cluster for the shutoff block, so I'll drop the shutoff block number into the name. Then I will do a direct select of that shutoff block and bring the shutoff block up into my query area. This is now the shutoff block that I am going to develop a cluster for. As before, I move over into the define area and I can see that the shutoff block is made up of 2 assets. This asset is long and has 7 failures. I can tick that asset to be replaced, or I can run my heuristics and find that that asset gets replaced by the rules I have set up. I can save that, move across into the GIS, and I can see where that asset is in relation to other shutoff blocks that have renewal in them. In this case, it's an isolated shutoff block with nothing else around it. So my decision making would be whether or not that asset needs to be replaced. If I go back into my cluster management table, you'll see that because I've added a new cluster, I need to refresh the table. I will refresh the table and then search on the cluster. And I can see out of the clusters that are in the software, the one that I have generated ranks 41st. So in other words, it isn't a high priority in the context of other clusters that have been generated by others. The cluster rank here is defined in the settings under prioritization. Currently, we have prioritization for in terms of failures avoided and the cluster customers. I can change that how I wish. So for example, I can change it so that I focus on the cost effectiveness and the failures avoided. So effectively what this means is the cheaper it is to remove a burst, the higher the priority, and the more bursts that are predicted to be removed over the planning horizon, the higher the priority. If I save that and go back to my cluster management table, again, you will see that it's asking me to refresh the table because I have now defined how these metrics are used differently. Now we've seen 2 ways of building up a cluster. The first and most common use is to run what we call the P queries and auto-generate the clusters. The second is to identify an asset of concern or a shutoff block of concern and then start up a new query and direct select that shutoff block. The other approach is to start a new query and then use the query controls down here to select a shutoff block of interest. So similar to the query controls in the Network Explorer, I have a range of options that I can set up. So in this case, I'm going to ask the software to bring me all of the shutoff blocks that have failed at more than 7 times. And I'm not interested if they're already in one of the clusters that have been developed. So I run the network, and these are the shutoff blocks that meet the criteria that I've specified. I can order these, and it would be logical to take the shutoff block with the highest failure rate or the highest failures So in this case, this shutoff block has 24 failures. It's not in the cluster shutoff block already, so that seems like a reasonable candidate for me to do some renewal in. I will add that down into this section of the software and then move across into the define area. Because I am creating the cluster from new, there is nothing defined in terms of the target renewals. Again, I will copy the cell from the block ident and rename my cluster so it's referencing the shutoff block. I will then run the heuristics, and in this case, it's selecting these two assets here. The reason for that is that these two assets are above the rating 5 level, which if we go back to our settings, is set to 180 for our statistical predictions, and we are using statistical predictions here. These two assets have not been selected. However, it makes good sense to replace these pipes at the same time as replacing these. We can confirm that decision by going over into the GIS. So potentially it makes sense for me to replace the whole shutoff block. So to add these in through the GIS, I need to save the cluster, then use the icon here. I select the assets that I'm interested and mark them for renewal. Where there's a small asset like this one, zoom in and mark it for renewal at that level. If we want to zoom back to the query selection, we can use this icon here, or it may be just easier to select it from the define view. Again, if I go over to my cluster management, I find that I need to recalculate the table because I have added a new cluster. I can refresh it and I can paste in my shutoff block, and you'll see this time that the cluster is actually ranked quite high in comparison to the others. When managing your clusters, it's sometimes useful to be able to bulk delete clusters that you're no longer interested in. So I can open the bulk delete by clicking on the button here. That shows up a series of tick boxes. I can then order as I wish and select the tick boxes, then right click and change the selected value, change it to a tick, and then bulk delete those. I get a warning, and now those have been deleted.